I think we can start now. Sorry for the delay, it's because of concern about the room that have been changed at the last moment. So good morning everybody, thank you for being there. Just a few words to remind in which context this workshop takes place. It's the fourth of a series of workshops gathered under the seminar Internationalizing Cities, organized by the PUCA and the LATS, under supervision of Olivier Coutard and Christian Lefebvre. This series of workshops aims to explore internationalization as a set of constraints, resources and opportunities, both for urban development and policies. The program analyzes modalities of urban production in its various dimensions, culture, material and technological aspects, economic and finance, politics, and social change. It gathers various topics related to economics, policy, and social practices. And among these topics, it was obvious that we couldn't talk of city internationalization without dealing with international migrations. And more precisely about international migrants within the city. International migrants are one of the most visible aspects of internationalization of cities, and one, of course, of the most widely covered by the media. Relation between cities and migrants have been a classic issue since the Chicago School, and the perspective on this topic has, in the last few decades, been deeply redefined at the crossroad of urban studies and migration studies. So the objective of this workshop is to fuel the dialogue between those two fields of study through urban places and urban migrants approaches. And to explore articulation between urban contexts and urban practices. There is a wide range of topics involved in this interrelation between urban change, migrant practices, and migration policies. And our goal by organizing this workshop, Eric Charm and I, was to gather different approaches on this migrant-city nexus. One approach based on a socio-professional categorization of migrants, a second based on a theoretical framework of analyzing migrants' urban integration process, a third based on a specific economic sector, ethnic entrepreneurship, and the fourth based on a specific type of urban place where the question of migrants' urban integration is critically raised. So Eric Charm and I are very glad that the researchers we contacted have accepted to make a presentation today. We want to thank them warmly for that. And we want to thank Valérie Boquillon and Nicolas Mazzetti as well for their great support in the organization. So now it's time, I think, to give the floor to the speakers of the first session, which is dedicated to the migration of the dominants. Thank you again for being here. So just to introduce this session in a very few words, we are glad to welcome Michaela Benson, which is in the London University, Goldsmiths, and has been working on lifestyle migration. I think we will discuss this term. And Patrick Le Galès from Sciences Po, Ecole urbaine, Centre d'études européennes. This session is dedicated to the migrations of dominants between cosmopolitanism and communautarianism. And the aim here is to focus and discuss about urban practices of the migrants of high social status. These profiles are relatively ignored, or at least seldom investigated in the migration studies, especially in the French-speaking context. And we assume that these migrants have peculiar urban practices and thus play a specific role in its production and in urban change more widely. And it has to be accurately explored. And the categorization itself, I think we will talk of that, categorization itself has to be discussed. Migrant elites, highly skilled migrants, or expatriates. So, thank you, Michaela, to launch this discussion with the presentation. You have 20 minutes.
20 minutes, right, okay, I better get going then. So I want to start with a little brief description. This is Panama City, 2015, January 2015. At the center of Panama City lies a barrio, Panama City's banking district. On previous visits, I've passed through in the evening, visiting the Lebanese restaurant on the corner, the American sports bar with some of the North Americans resident in the city. And now in January 2015, I'm staying in a new hotel in the heart of this district, my room on the 15th floor, looking out over the city. I take in the view, the original low-slung dwellings with their spacious gardens dwarfed by the skyscrapers that increasingly dominate the skyline, the homes to multinational banks, luxury hotels, and executive apartment blocks. The cranes and half-finished buildings, on pause for the night, are a common feature of this city at the crossroads of the world. The sprawling mall, multi-plaza, a cool, air-conditioned space, with shining marble floors where they sell luxury international brands alongside a range of North American and Spanish high street retailers. And in the distance, yet more skyscrapers dominate the Atlantic shoreline of the city, more luxury hotels and condos, including the exclusive Trump Ocean Club, looking out to the cargo ships and cruise liners, each waiting their turn to transit through the Panama Canal. Until the leaking of the Panama Papers, the canal would have been the only thing people would be able to recall as they thought of Panama. A significant contributor to the country's economy, the strongest in Central America and the second strongest in Latin America, the canal is the source of a large amount of the country's FDI. Then there are the free trade zones, but also increasingly international property investment. In 2007, when I first visited Panama, reading the Lonely Planet Guide to Panama, I came across a statement from the then mayor of Panama City that prefaced this investment. Naively, at that time, I didn't really think that it would take off. This is not the first time that I've thought about the relationship between these developments and the lifestyle migration that I've been studying out in Panama's provinces. Panama's ambitions to become the crossroads of the world, an ambition that they now recognize as extending beyond the canal, despite its recent expansion. But the aggressive transformations of the central city reflect the escalation of foreign money seeping into Panama's economy, as we now know from the Panama Papers. So really here what I want to do is to introduce another way of thinking about migrants and the internationalization of cities. And actually specifically position what we might understand as the world's middle classes and their influence on these reshapings of the world's cities, and looking towards the structures that facilitate this. And I'm thinking here with migration in its relation to property capitalism, rather than the labour migrations that we're very familiar with. FDI, foreign direct investment, is certainly part of this. And we can see, as we look around the world, a greater number of countries exploring property markets precisely as a way of increasing their FDI, attracting both individual and corporate investments. My point of entry here is to say that the international property investment market is much more complex and more far-reaching than the simple equation that sees the global elite shoring up their capital by investing in secure property markets, creating what has been referred to as buy-to-leave markets, with global cities such as London deserted, dark and empty as night falls. Selling and buying destinations and the lifestyle available there, such as can be seen in the case of Panama, is another notable dimension of international property investment. And this time, it is paired with migration. So this is my point of entry. So for a long time, I've been working on a phenomenon that I refer to as lifestyle migration. This is a way of talking about people who we might more commonly recognize as resident foreigners, expatriates, or even tourists. Definitions which, while highlighting privilege, render these migrant populations invisible within migration discourse of both sending and receiving nations. Importantly, for this paper, I'm talking about how they are actively encouraged to invest and reside in host countries. Foreign direct investment through property ownership, a lesser known dimension of the relationship between migration and development. And I won't have time to go into this today, but it's very clear that the movements of these populations brings with it consequences in the countries of settlement. Their migration is both the result of wider social processes and wider processes of social, economic, and political transformation, but also a contributor to further change. And we know that this also links to discourses about global gentrification as a consequence of bringing about changes in social structures and hierarchies. So just to introduce lifestyle migration to you a little bit more, this is a concept that I've been working with, notably with my colleague Karen O'Reilly and with Nick Osbalderson over the course of about the last 10 years. The intention behind this was the development of a conceptual and theoretical framework that could explain how lifestyle mediates, shapes, and is structured through the migration of the relatively affluent, and how this in turn might provide some insights into how we might think about the relationship between migration and privilege. The conceptualization sought both to identify the structural and material conditions that made migration thinkable and possible, as well as describing how migration acts within ongoing processes of subjectivity making. So this then reflects on how the migrants see themselves, who they are within that. As a concept, it's gained traction in making sense of a wide and increasing variety of privileged migration flows. Notably, we started off by studying British populations in Spain and France, and now this seems to have been taken up and extended all around the world. The privilege of these populations, who are often white, although not always white, quite significant within that. So the focus on consumption and identity within this conceptualization has resulted in the presentation of lifestyle migration as an individualized migration, aligned with sociological theories of the self and underpinned by concerns with migrant subjectivities and the attendant structural conditions. Often, however, the focus has been on the way that structure impacts on these subjectivities. So, for example, in my work on British people living in rural France, how changes in the British economy were significant to class formation and the accumulation of property assets, which in turn facilitated migration to rural France, or how redundancy and restructuring of the labour force in Britain were part of the context within which people moved. And more recently, Matthew Hayes, who's been working on US citizens moving to Ecuador, has encouraged us to look at how economic and political transformation in the US has become part of the rationale for the migration of these people, permitting a form of geographic arbitrage where people are able to deploy the assets accumulated in a high-value economy to support lives led in a lower-value economy. So this shifts the focus on, to how the privilege of these subjects, which facilitate such migrations, is structured by global inequalities and asymmetries of power, and moves towards this kind of statement about undoing privilege. But also what becomes clear here is that structure in a lot of the framings of the research on lifestyle migration has been explored primarily in the way that structure interplays in the formation of privileged subjectivities. So I want to shift the focus today and look instead at another side, or another way into thinking about structure, and particularly thinking about the international property investment market. And I think that this quotation from Michael Janowska and Heiko Haas is a particularly good entree into thinking about this. They're talking about the relationship here between lifestyle migration and economic development within countries. Property investment is central within this. The migrant in this acts as a resource for development. They are an untold tale, but when we come to these more privileged migrants, they don't feature in that discussion of the migration and development nexus. So I'm going to try and map out a conceptual terrain that brings migration studies, urban studies, and tourism studies into conversation with one another to develop a rich and nuanced understanding of how migration and international property investment might interplay within contemporary urban development. So what we know is that migration has often been intimately related to economic and social development. When we look at this, we can see that recent scholarly considerations of thinking through this center on the transnational circulation that's central to this. The transmigrant and the transnational operations of institutions become significant figures within this migration development network nexus. The transnational perspective on migration therefore calls for a strengthening and deepening of understandings of the migration development relationship that recognises what Falzer and Feist have referred to as the macro-structural factors and paradigms in which current debates and new policies are embedded, and second, the meso-level phenomena of transnational actors and associated transfers beyond the limited but dominating focus on financial remittances. So just briefly, financial remittances are one of the main ways in which people understand the relationship between migration and economic development. But what happens if we start to think about lifestyle migrants as resources? This term would pitch the migrant as an agent of development in both sending and receiving countries, the transferal of resources and assets across borders, contributing in many ways to the development in countries. And quite often when we're looking at the migration development nexus, people are looking at the role of emigrants, people who've left those countries, the money that they send back, the impact of those economic remittances on the landscapes within which they're moving to. But what's strange, I think, is that within that quite vast body of work, they don't talk about these more elite populations moving into countries and the significance of that towards that. So, and this is why I think that thinking about international property investment as a form of foreign direct investment might be an interesting way of reinvigorating that discussion so that we have a discussion of the relationship between migration and development that can allow the role of the elites within this. So foreign direct investment is one of the 4 strands of development that we know about that's been highlighted by Ron Skeldon. It's writ large in the structural conditions that support and encourage what I'm referring to here as lifestyle migration. The identification of certain locales as resource niches and the development of migration destinations attractive for relatively affluent incomers, as is made clear in the literature on amenity migration and lifestyle migration, are part of ongoing processes of urbanisation and economic development. Zoning land for residential tourism development, engaging in the promotion and place marketing of locales to international audiences, is increasingly an element of how many governments are courting international financial capital and is undoubtedly linked to economic advancement and development. And it's clear that this is not restricted to nation states in the global south. We have a very, very good record of what happened on the Spanish coastline in the 1980s and 1990s, for example, in very similar ways to what we're now seeing in many global and world cities. Now, of course, international property investment doesn't, as a matter of course, lead to migration and residence. On the contrary, the current critical attention on international property investment focuses on the phenomenon of empty homes and what this does to place. However, as current research on lifestyle migration evidences, For these types of populations, there is a significant relationship between property ownership and migration. These are not second homeowners. Many of the people that I've worked with in France and Panama claim these countries as their primary residence, selling up completely in their country of origin to support their lives in these new destinations. So how can we approach this? I think that the kind of discussions that have been focused on transnational investment and entrepreneurship, emigrant entrepreneurship, can provide some initial pointers about how we might approach such cases where international property investment gives rise to migration and residence. The focus on housing development and property investment by emigrants, whether for their own future residence, that of their families, or for more general investment purposes, and how this interplays with economic development, provide one point of entry. And we can see this, for example, in Sarah Lynn Lopez's discussion of how migrant remittances and the properties that are built using this are fundamental to changes in the built environment and urban development in rural Mexico. However, what's less documented in this literature is the way that governments encourage international property investment, not only by their expatriated citizens, but by non-nationals, and the shifts in public policy that produce favourable conditions for the border crossing of these relatively affluent and mobile subjects. So, to return to the case of Panama as an example, Sigler and Washmush focus on the transnational investment in property development and regeneration in Casco Antiguo, the colonial quarter of Panama City. The gentrification and regeneration of this historic district made possible by, as they describe, leisure-driven migration to spatially distant neighbourhood reinvestment schemes that existing local demand may not have allowed for. Such urban transformation, to reiterate, is made possible precisely through the interface of local and global actors and capitals. And while Sigler and Washmush set up a conceptual argument that draws on the global and transnational into understandings of gentrification, they're less attentive to the significant shifts in relation to planning and land reform ongoing in Panama that undoubtedly shape the possibilities for international investment. So, to summarise, the relationship here that I'm talking about sees lifestyle migration and FDI reliance made through this individual investment in off-plan housing, whether within areas rezoned for residential development or on individual plots, or renovation and refurbishment projects. So what's going on in a lot of these places is in attracting these individuals, these relatively affluent individuals, they're asking for upfront investment by individual households, and it's this upfront investment that provides cash flow for property development to take place. Individual households become the primary source of development finance, with such opportunities promoted to foreign investment, and therefore we're talking about FDI. This mechanism of housing development and its link to national economic development through FDI, with foreign nationals at the level of the household financing property development, is notable. It additionally functions to reduce the responsibilities of the state and related financial investments from risking the investment in these property developments themselves. Well, with many countries involved in courting FDI through such mechanisms, there is a competitive arena, a competitive global arena for these investments, an international and global market in international property investment. And MIPIM might be the most high-profile event promoting this market, but less widely known and commented on is the vast industry that has grown up around international property investment, including the myriad smaller property fairs, magazines, investment seminars and workshops, and broadcast media that make living abroad imaginable and attractive for the world's middle classes. Considerable work goes into making investments of this type attractive in a highly competitive market where states are vying for international capital. These actions aim at putting places on the global investment map and involve the careful curation of imaginings about the lives available there, because this is a residence-based investment. It isn't just people shoring up capital in safe parts of the world or places that they think are safe. They have to attract people to go and live there. So they involve the development of incentives that include, among other, specialist visa regimes, tax incentives and exemptions, discounts on imports and medical care. And Panama is a useful case because it's been particularly successful in drawing up an offer attractive to such international investment, and is notably home to considerable populations of foreign nationals who are resident on these terms. This includes North Americans, Canadians, but also quite a lot of South Americans, people moving from Argentina, from Chile, all of these types of places, people who would have been occupying middle-class jobs in the countries that they've come from. Migration regimes and governance are a significant feature of the landscape in which most contemporary international migrations take place. These are regulated and controlled by the nation-state. And when we shift across to these kind of desirable subjects, who I call migrants, we can see what states are doing to provide an easy passage for these people in. Importantly, when we look at the framing of migration around property relations, there are different points of entry. So it's quite notable that the visas that are used to support these people who are moving to the US, the North Americans, the Canadians, are actually administered by the Ministry of Tourism, not the Ministry of Migration, which I think says a lot about what's going on there. Panama has been much lauded in the international lifestyle media on retirement and property investment, with academics stressing that such marketing privileges the better way of life that these populations seek. In addition to the natural amenities that the country offers, a further attraction is the pensionado visa, a program specifically designed by the Panamanian government to attract foreign retirees to move to the country through property ownership. It provides visa holders with property and import tax exemptions, a range of significant discounts on the cost of travel, healthcare, and everyday expenses. It's available to individuals and households on the proviso that they have a monthly pension for life exceeding $1,000, or in the case that they own property worth $100,000 or more, with a monthly income or pension over $750. It's worth remembering that the Panamanian economy parallels the US economy. It's a US dollar economy, for want of a better way of putting it. So this means that with the exception of Panama Province, where the average household income per month is $826, the income required of foreign residents on pensionado visas significantly exceeds average household incomes. There are other routes through which they attract people in Panama, but this is just one of them that is particularly prominent and definitely one that's particularly celebrated. It's important to remember that these visas exist alongside other types of visas, other regulations for different migrant populations, and that this is a way in which borders work to exclude some people and allow other people in. Importantly, what we're seeing in the case of Panama is the way that the governance of migration embraces these desirable migrants because of the investments, their consumer power, their ability to purchase property, and the perceived limited demands that they're then going to place on the Panamanian economy. So I just want to turn very briefly, before I conclude, towards another player in this field of international property investment and migration, the international marketing, imagineering, and placemaking that puts these locations on the map, so to speak. And I can go into more detail if anyone's interested about what happened in Panama in 2005, which meant that all of a sudden it became a really popular place, the best place in the world to retire to, a position that it's held for the last coming up to 12 years. So at the time of writing in 2016, so this is when I was previously drafted the paper, Panama is listed as in the top 5 destinations to retire to in International Living's annual Global Retirement Index. It's regularly featured in International Living, a publication which started life 35 years ago as a newsletter focused on a simple message: you can live better for less overseas. International Living is just one of many publications that propound the virtues of moving abroad, an improved retirement lifestyle paired with the optimization of financial resources. The onus is placed on the individual retiree to pursue ways of improving their retirement. Presented positively, these representations gloss over the wider context of increasing insecurity over pensions and the cost of healthcare that we're facing in many economies. Living abroad, at least as these publications present it, becomes a way of enhancing or enriching quality of life at a lower cost. And this pairing of financial investment and lifestyle as a discourse in support of migration, albeit for those relatively privileged within global power structures, is an addendum that calls into question taken for granted understandings of the relationship between migration and economics, both as this is understood in relation to individual migrants and as this is embedded in political discourse about migration and in migration governance structures. Further, rather than benign forces, such lifestyle media promoting geographic arbitrage are caught up in the wider political economy of migration, part of a nexus that includes property developments and government ministries. And yet, my argument here and my reason for bringing this here is that this is a story that's not so readily on view. So just a quick recap, and then I am going to stop, don't worry. I've used the case of lifestyle migration to Panama and the various structures that support and promote this to highlight the way in which economic development is caught up with international property investment. While others have sought to explain how the movement of capital by the world's high net worth individuals is significant within this, I intervene by showing how, below these glossy images of the super rich, there are parallel movements of capital and people from the world's middle classes. Working closely with these populations highlights that they're lifestyle migrants, relatively affluent individuals seeking a better way of life elsewhere, with clear consideration of their consumption practices in post-migration life driving their migration, but they are also located in a wider political economy of migration and investment capital in ways that move us beyond analyses that focus on mere considerations of class and belonging. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Monday morning. Yep, sorry, with the wrong. Right. Thanks for the invitation to discuss this subject. Well, one thing I was not entirely sure about your presentation was the idea that we should look at the dominance. I always a bit not sure about what you mean by dominance, meaning that either you are a serious Bourdieu scholar, and then D'accord. Up. Okay. And then you really think about the field within which you are dominant, or this is cheap talk and it doesn't help very much. So you should be careful about dominance. I remember doing my interviews about some expatriates in Dubai, and those foreigners living in Dubai, earning 4 times what they earn in their own country, they feel dominé. Because, of course, in Dubai, the local population is like 10 times richer than they are, and they have no rights whatsoever. So thinking about dominant, I was just thinking, we should be careful. My presentation is more about not exactly the elite, and that's one of the big difference we'll be discussing. I've been interested for a long time on mobility and the extent to which your Martinotti old book, various groups of people going through the city are having an impact on the transformation of the city. And what we have tried to do with my 2 colleagues, Alberta Andreotti and Francesco Javier Moreno Fuentes from Madrid, was to do some research about the mobility and the impact on city, not on the elite, I'll come back to that later, but on the sort of people 10% in terms of income, okay, between 5 and 15. Not the 1% global elite. You know, we do a lot of research, that's fine, but some different people. So our research was more a research originally about sociology. We are trying to understand the slow, incremental process changing European societies. And we think that if you want to study that, you need to understand those elements on mobility and how increased mobility is slowly becoming a cleavage, a differentiation process within European societies. And of course, we are urban scholars. We think that in cities you have to study that. So it's a way also to link with some issues about, do we see cosmopolitan groups in the making or new urban European middle class? But my real question is, you know, to what extent some forms of mobility are, exactly like Michaela said, are transforming also the local society, how you combine international mobility and the transformation of cities and national society, asking who is mobile, who is taking advantage of this, what are the mechanisms explaining those things. So that was the questions we had in this research, and because we are sociologists, we like to measure, so we try to get some elements. So I will use, the book was published in English and in French, Un monde à la carte. For those who are interested, the details are there. Remember that in the literature we have a lot of research, and for those who were there first sessions, I like to mock the critical urban scholars. There are different ways to be critical, but there's a lot of research about all this global elite explaining everything. There's a nice book in English called The New Barbarians. Once a professor of, I think it was engineering and finance at the London Business School, wrote a little book explaining that in the New World, what was happening was that transnational links and mobility were completely destroying existing society. The world was a world coming, of course, his students studying engineering and business at the London Business School, of free-floating, talented individuals going along the world, making money, going to Panama, coming back, and avoiding social systems, tax, avoiding old national elite, and moving the quick and the dead. Those people are studied also in Dubai. But the problem is we were interested in understanding European societies. And we know that in terms of relationship to territory, to family, to cities, well, I argue at least, that those in Europe, on the continent, the UK is an exception. As we know, the UK is an exception of many things, but in particular for urban phenomenon and for the transformation of societies. So what we know about Europe is that historically, when you think about the making of national society, you had two very strong mechanisms that Max Weber explained beautifully. Number one, when you want to make a national society, you create borders, and you make the cost of exit important. You try to prevent external influence to structure the national society and to limit exit strategy. And the second mechanism, you try to create interdependence within groups, within national society. A war is wonderful because you reinforce border and you create interdependence, okay? So Michael Mann, the British sociologist, used to say that the war and the welfare state, warfare and welfare, were encaging society. So our starting point is, we know that all these mechanisms don't work anymore, far more or less than before, particularly with the EU. So what? So what for the making of society and, for instance, for the transformation of our cities? And you know there's a literature from the Marxist groups, especially Leslie Clare in England, wonderful scholar, look at the making of a transnational class. David Harvey arguing for a global middle class. We have a lot of interesting research about that. We are more Weberian scholars. We try to understand more precisely those differentiation processes taking place at the urban and the national level. To what extent those who are mobile are more and more different from those who are not mobile. To what extent the making of the urban fabric is differentiated when you look at people who are transnational, who are mobile from that point of view, and those who are immobile and don't move. Do we see this transnational mobility as a new differentiation process? And not just for 1% super rich living in plains, but for more, a group which is more substantial in society. So what we know also is that we have a literature on mobility, and I was very close to John Urry, the great scholar in England of mobility. and John has been written for many years before he died on all these issues of mobility. The problem with his argument is measure. It's that when you look at EU, you know that the EU Commission makes a report every 2 or 3 years about mobility in Europe. We've done the single market, everybody's moving or should move, and the answer is no, 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 no. Europeans are getting more mobile transnationally, meaning changing country 1 year to the next, a little bit more every year. It's very, very, very slow. Okay? They're far less mobile than in the US, both transnationally and inside. So what we know is that all this literature on mobility is grossly exaggerated, this issue of mobility. So our first hypothesis is, what we know about European societies is that Europeans are deeply rooted in their cities and their regions. We know that the pattern of mobility historically is from a small village to the small town, to a regional capital, to the national capital, and that those patterns change very slowly, okay? That's something we know in the sociology of Europe. So the point we have was studying mobility makes no sense if you study mobility for itself. Mobility make only sense if you relate mobility to your embeddedness, to your ancrage, to where you are. And it's the link between the two that may make sense of the sort of mobility we see in European cities. So instead of arguing, flow gains space, mobility changes everything, sort of January going a bit over the top sometimes, at least in these European countries we know, you should be thinking about these connections. Okay, that's a very important point from a point of view of methodology. So, do we see a European bourgeoisie in the making? Okay, we'll see. Try to contribute to that. So, questions: do we see this making? Can we, see some people exiting? I use exit voice loyalty to study the same thing that Michaela has been arguing. Some people just going away. So our second big hypothesis is, well, when we study a lot of European cities we are familiar with, we don't see many people leaving for good. Some of the people Michaela mentioned, it's very common in the UK, it's been for a long time. We know that the figures are very, very small in the rest of Europe, particularly in the southwest of Europe, where agriculture was more important. So the point is, we see more and more people moving, and we have data on mobility. So we had the idea of developing the hypothesis of partial exit. We argue that people probably, they go away, but, for some time, and probably they come back. And they use going away as a way to accumulate resources and to improve the resources, the capital, the money they have, their prestige, the degree they have, to improve the situation in the national hierarchy. So our key hypothesis is transnational mobility is peanut in terms of number in Europe, very important for some global elite, 1% maybe, it's minimum. By contrast, lots of people become transnationally mobile because they use that to get resources outside to come back where they are, and in terms of legitimacy, resource, prestige, to improve their situation in their national hierarchy. Okay, so it's a different way to think about the subject. So we call that partial exit. So the idea is, well, we want to understand those. So we decided to come back to study middle class. I'll come back in a minute. We have the idea of 2 dimensions we want to study. Those who are transnational, I will give you indicators in a minute, and those who are not transnational. Okay? Some people are very transnational, some are immobile. Second dimension, some people, they try also to exit from the urban fabric. So they are trying to live in gated communities and to be completely separated from the city. And by contrast, some people are very much part of the city and try to combine and to be active in all sorts of ways in terms of network. So 2 by 2, the base of social science. So you have 4 categories from a beginning, which is our hypothesis. Do we find barbarians, people who are transnationally mobile and isolated from the city? Do we see majority of those middle classes being immobile and very rooted in the city? And then the 2 other categories moving. So that was our framework, and I wanted to develop that because of the result. We decided to study France, Britain, France, UK, Spain, and Italy, but in fact we didn't study the UK. We had some background data from Michael Savage and Tim Butler that we use in comparison. And we studied Paris, Lyon, Madrid, and Milan. Wanted to do more, didn't have the money, that's life. Again, we are not studying the elite. We decided that when you look at the data, we know that very clearly there are two populations who are mobile. The migrants, the one you'll discuss this afternoon, and the middle class, who are the more mobile. We look at trip, holidays, all these things. So we wanted to study this group, like 5 to 15% in terms of income, with a master degree. And if those people are becoming very transnationally mobile, then there's a chance this is going to be more important within European societies. So in French, we call them cadres supérieurs, okay? Income, master degree, and they work in private and public organization, and they have people working for them. For ones who are not studying us, university people or professions, we just leave them aside. Managers in public and private, and we did a lot of work on the category to compare the same kind of people. And the last thing in terms of method, we tried to, we decided to study, let's go fast, the way we did the sample. It's not a representative sample. We had a big questionnaire, about 90 minutes, and we did the Elmo-Pritzey strategy. We studied a representation of neighborhoods. So for each city, we chose 2 neighborhoods in the suburbs, 2 in the center, because we know it's a classic variables for middle class, and then 2 neighborhoods with very strong percentage of middle class, ghetto of middle class if you want, and 2 very mixed neighborhood. Okay, so 4 neighborhoods per city. And we use the index of Pritzey, which is very precise for Paris and Milan and Madrid more or less. So we have 4 neighborhoods in each, and in each neighborhood, about 2,000, 3,000 people usually, we interviewed 30 people with the same kind of criteria I mentioned before. So that's 120 interviews for each city. It's a convenient sample and reasonable. It's not a representative sample. Okay? So the 4 in Madrid, for those who know, I don't have time, so I should go further. The 4 in Milan, for those who know, and in Paris, we started by 6, but we'll come back to 4 as well. Le Vésinet for, of course, suburb upper class. Fontenay-sous-Bois, mixed suburb. 15th arrondissement, Beaugrenelle for upper class, middle class, Paris. And 17th arrondissement and a bit of a 10th for mix in Paris. All right, let me give you some results enough on the questionnaire and on the methods. So, first point I want to emphasize is, what do we say about mobility? I present 2 sets of results very briefly. Number 1, what do we say about the transnational of those people? Are they really transnational? What can we say? And these are the indicators we use, both virtual transnational and real transnational. And then what does it say about the way they operate within their cities? Okay? 2 sort of things. Basically, what we're arguing is Europeans, so again, cadre supérieur would be the word in French, sort of upper middle class, more than middle class. Managers in private and public organizations. The first result is that when we study this population, they are not very much mobile. Okay? This mobility is greatly exaggerated. Firstly, when we try to indicate, do you spend more than 6 months in your life in a foreign country? We'll come back to the result later on. Not much. Okay? Small number. Most people that we interviewed, their logic is, yes, either we go away, or we should go away at some point, but we come back where we lived before. Okay? So, of course, we have not interviewed those who've gone forever, but we know it's a very small number until recently. So basically, the logic, the European model is, we go away, and we come back where we used to live. When you present the result to an American audience, my colleagues say, this is not possible. You mean those people, they go for 3 years in Vietnam and they come back in the same neighborhood they were before? Yes, that's what they do. Okay? It's just go away and come back where you were before. Neighborhood or commune sometimes. Second, they want to go away, but not for too long. Okay? Not many people go for a long time. They'd like to go for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years maybe, but most of them, they go, not too much. Thirdly, they don't go very far. I'll show you the map later. Basically, those Europeans who go transnational, meaning they spend more than 6 months in a foreign country, where do they go? country next door. Geography comes back. Most of them go to the cities and countries just around massively. Only a very tiny number go far away. So you don't go far, you go back where you were before, you go not for a long time, and you try to do that when you are sure that when you come back, you have a good situation. So you are transnational, mais à l'abri. Huh? You keep your base very safe. It's not about like huge, it's the completely opposite to what Michaela has been saying. That was a bit before the crisis, the beginning of the crisis. Those who really go and are more transnational, the push factors are, of course, the labor market. If you look at finance, you have to go to London. Women are the big ones wanting to live. For obvious reasons, partial exit. Women in Milan or Madrid, if you're a manager, you don't get a top job. The only way to get a top job is to go to the US, to go to Milan, to go to London, Paris, and then you come back in Milan and Madrid and you get a top job. So this partial exit is completely verified in the case of women. Yups. So managers with experience abroad. Basically, we have three populations, classically. And one group just doesn't move at all. You know, the level of transnational mobility is very, very, very small. Second, we have some people who, you know, are moving, but not to live away. They move for holidays, to visit their children, to do all sorts of things. And only a small, about 25%, have spent more than 6 months in a foreign country. So, you know, again, mobility, not too much. And those who move, usually we see clear benefits of a career, limited period, and they move next door. Okay, these are fancy things, but I don't have time to show you the details. But these people, that's the cities they know very well. Where do they move? Well, they basically move in Europe. Okay, so if you are in Lyon, for instance, most people who are Lyon, which city do they know? They know Milan, they know Geneva, they may go a bit further down in Italy, they may go a bit in Germany, maybe up to England, and that's it. That's a huge amount of them, they just don't go further than that. We have some people in Africa, usually from African origin, and then we have only small numbers who have been to Asia or America. America meaning, you know, basically North America and basically New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So, you know, not much going on. So we have these three groups we identify: the immobile, the rooted and mobile majority, and those who are really transnational. I'll stop on the transnational one, and I want to finish 5 minutes, 2 minutes? 5? Okay, on the urban element. So we see those people are mobile to some extent. What's the link with the way they organize within the city, how they operate? And these are the sort of indicators we have been using. You know, we've done a lot of network analysis, all the service they use, how they, you know, participate, all the social practice indicators. We have a long list of indicators. And the questionnaire was a mix of quali and quanti, so you could do both sorts of element. So what do we say about them? Number one, we studied, of course, their residential choices. Where do these people live, and why do they choose to live there? And our result is most of literature on gentrification is vastly exaggerated. Gentrification plays a role in European city a little bit in some very small neighborhood. Okay? This is sort of myth in geography about gentrification everywhere. You know, when you look at things precisely, no, no, and no empirically, unless you say it's everything. Okay? So I've got a long debate with Laura Charlize on that, but no. What we see is the majority of people, where do they choose to live? Not to make money on a poor neighborhood. They choose to live in a neighborhood where they have some family and friends. We are in Europe. Family, 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 and friends. Okay? This is not the UK. We know that there's a big difference between, you know, you have all these Eurobarometer survey. Do you see your brothers and sisters and parents every day? Often, people say yes. You know, in Manchester, they see them twice a year, maybe. Often, on average. In Milan, twice a week. Okay? We have different social structure. So the way people choose to locate, in Paris, 40% of these middle class managers we studied chose their neighborhood because they had lived there when they were young, they had some family around, or their best friends were not too far. Okay? So, over-determination, even in Paris, of choice of location for logic linked to social networks and family. The number of people choosing one arrondissement in Paris because they went to school there when they were young, or their brother lives next door, or their best friend is not far away, that's the big results of our survey. Just shows you the opposite to what you say in gentrification study. So, and we see in every indicator, we see also a lot of what Maloutas had shown for Greece, on-site social mobility. So we see a lot of managers who stay in mixed neighborhood. They could go elsewhere, they've got the money. Where do they stay in Villeurbanne in Lyon? Where do they stay in Fontenay-sous-Bois in Paris? Why? Because their family was there. They just stayed there. And they know the place, they got the networks, they become dominant in their neighborhood in some ways, but you have a lot of social mobility just by staying in the same place. And we see important numbers in all the cities we have studied, including Madrid, on these things. Milan, a bit less. So choosing the city, we say inherited belonging in a way. Choosing the place remains strong, not for everybody, but quite a lot. And I've got an example of phrase. It's even more in everything is more in Milan. Italians, just family is even more. So in Milan, it's just grossly exaggerated for all of you. But it's true for all other figures we had. Second result, how do they operate in the city? Do they want to be separated? How do they invest in the city? The results are very clear. In our data is overwhelming. Number one, very, very little sign of gated community. Those people, those cadres supérieurs, they are not interested in gated communities, most of them. Okay? What they do is a very sophisticated game we call distance and proximity. It's a classic in urban sociology. You see these people, basically, I will just take two examples. If you live in a mixed neighborhood, you are not a newcomer. Those managers who live in mixed neighborhood, they do that because they have been there for a long time. They know exactly when they want to mix with ethnic group or working class people. And they are very good to avoid any kind of mix in other cases. To give you an example, we had one of his managers who were living in the 10th arrondissement and saying, we are in this neighborhood which is very mixed, Gare du Nord, da-da-da. But of course, our children play cello, after school. And of course, they're in the private sector. Because if we mix with everybody, we are very mixed people. But on serious issues, and by contrast, I did some interviews in Le Vésinet, so, very upper class, and people say, well, for our children, we put them in the public school. Of course, because it's mixed. Well, in the Vésinet, it's not very mixed. You can afford to be mixed because you don't have too many of them. And sport, no, my children play football because, they have to mix with other kids who are not all of the way middle class. So you just sort of lower the importance of exclusion by making mixed activities on the margin that you choose. And we have a lot of evidence in our survey of this sophisticated game of, control and proximity. Relation of power are overwhelming. One very good indicator is people moving, new people coming to Paris, to Lyon, for instance. New people coming to Lyon. Where do they go to live? They don't go to Villeurbanne, the managers. They don't know Lyon. They come from outside. Where do they go? They go in the west suburb of Lyon because they know nothing. So at least they know that the schools will be good, the family will be fine. We know nothing. We cannot play the game of distance and proximity. So we go in the most exclusive middle-class place. And then 10 or 15 years later, they may mix and they go to different neighborhoods. So the more rooted you are in the city, the more you accept to mix with people in all sorts of things, but always in control. If you cannot control your interactions, then you go away. Okay? That will be the logic. So it's different from gentrification and gated communities. And in terms of lifestyle, there's a literature in the UK again, because on privatism and the idea of using private services. Not at all. These people say, we want good public services for us. We want public hospitals, we want public schools, we want public transport, but we want those services to fit our needs. Okay? We don't want to go private. We don't want to pay too much, but we want those schools so our kids can learn English. Okay? But they want public sector very strong, as long as it follows our priority. So that's more or less what I wanted to present today. In conclusion, I would say, a sophisticated game of distance and proximity, very strong social homogamy as well. What was overwhelming in our study is the extent to which those managers, upper middle class, when you look at who are your best friends, who do you marry, who do you meet on Saturday night, the level of homogeneity of the social networks is frightening. Okay? They just meet, go out, go on holidays, marry exactly the same people. So you have a hardening of social homogamy in the French case that we know very well. And of course, it's because of women, as you know, because the more women do have money and have degrees, they only marry men with the same level of education. So you have more and more middle-class couples, basically. It's a reinforcement of middle-class couples, and their children will be even more middle-class. So this dynamics is very strong in cities, as it is for the French population. So we develop this ideas, urban hypothesis of social reproduction. Okay, conclusion. As I said, this globalizing world is more a virtual globalized world for the middle class we studied. Okay, they say it's very, very important. We are the avant-garde, and our children will be transnational. But for us, we'll wait a little bit. Okay, we do a bit, but not too much. Number one. Number two, there are no nomads, and there are no barbarians. That just doesn't exist in our survey. For the people we study within those 4 cities, we don't see them. Okay, and they want that with intense urban social life. They go out all the time. They use services. They are very rooted in all sorts of ways. Milan is just incredible. And that's what I wanted to present this morning. Thank you.
So, good morning. My name is Eric Charm. I'm one of the co-organizer of this of the workshop of today with Adrien. So, my mission for this session is to launch or start the discussion. So I will take a few minutes to make some comments on on both your presentation. Hopefully I had some idea of what you were saying before the session, so I took some notes and I tried to prepare a few points. First, we start with this session. It's not, we didn't really decide it because, in fact, there were some constraints with some of the speakers, so it happens that we start with this session. But I think it's interesting that we start with this session on those we call the dominants, and we may discuss this term, and because it's not very often that not so often that we focus on those social groups when we talk about migrations and immigrants. In most of the cases, and the 3 other sessions clearly illustrate that, we focus on low-income people, economic constraint, or political coercion. So it is true that researchers tend to focus on problems and those who have problems, and the people who don't have much problems, maybe they seem less interesting. Yet, as your 2 presentation clearly shows, this topic is not only interesting, it is important in order to understand what is at stake with migrations and to understand migrations also. So, and about lifestyle migrations, you talked about Michaela. I think your presentation show how helpful it is to start with those people that comes from migrate from richer countries to poorer countries because they get a higher standard of living, and it's important to understand migrations, not only the migrations of those people, and you clearly show which impact they may have on the city they come to live in. It also helps to understand migrations on the overall, because lifestyle migrations is clearly a dimension of all migrations, including those coming from poorer country to richer country. And because I suspect that European countries and Northern American countries are attractive to people coming from the South, the global South, not only for economic reason, but also for lifestyle, as you call it, reason. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on this. But in your presentation, you focus on you focus on the economic dimension of lifestyle migrations, but maybe there's other dimensions. I mean, if you're gay and if you come from, if you're living in a country like, let's say, Russia, maybe it can be attractive to move to some Western Europe countries, not only for economic reason. So maybe you can elaborate on that if you have some things to say about this. And Patrick, you discuss what we may consider a limit case, because maybe some here may wonder why you were invited, because you don't focus only on migrations, you focus on a population that is rooted in cities. They are not immigrants, and you don't focus on their experience of migration. Yet those people, you say their mobility is low, but still in one of your table, you show that men in Paris, 2/3 of them have lived abroad for at least 6 months. So this is quite significant. They are not migrants, but they have, I mean, it's part of their life experience, migration or living abroad. And I think overall it's half of the population who had this experience of living 6 months abroad. And this study, your study, clearly helps to understand how the national fit into the globalized economy. And one interesting point is that, on that respect, because you focused on new barbarians, because those people partially exiting from their countries, one interesting point is that whereas for the lower income migrants there is a fear of too much national rootedness, if I may call it like that, for the other end of the spectrum there is a fear of unrootedness, or of denationalization. So in fact, there's always a problem with the national, the way you relate to your national identity. And I think there's an interesting point of discussion about that. You mentioned John Urry. And Michaela, I don't think you, I haven't heard you mention his name, but in the paper you sent me, his name appears, and so John Urry, Patrick said a few words about his work, but he is stating that sociology should turn away from national spaces and to embrace mobilities, and especially mobilities across borders. Yet you both think that such general ideas do not help so much to understand things, and I agree with that, but I also think that we need to think further about those type of issues. In the 2000s, with thinkers like Urry and Beck came out the idea that a transnational and cosmopolitan new world was arising. Well, considering recent events, it looks like they were wrong. But at the same time, it looks obvious that some things are happening. I mean, things are changing. It is clear with those lifestyle migrants, people retiring abroad. I don't know the figure in France, but apparently in UK it's a significant movement. And there's also those managers that are more and more transnational in a way, even if they are still rooted in city, even in specific neighborhoods as you showed. So it's clear that big oppositions between national and global, mobile and immobile, doesn't really help to understand things. But I think we still have to probably think about this conceptually. The question is less now about the declining relevance of the national level, than how about it is redefined to all types of mobilities. But the problem is, we know that now, but how to conceptualize these relations? You said we need to think about the relation between the local and the global, the national and the transnational. But we still think in terms of opposition, like the local and the global, the national and the cosmopolitan, mobile, immobile, and so on. So how to think on how to conceptualize the current situation? We have concepts like hybridity, for example, and we say there's global. This concept of global is clearly thought of in terms of hybridity, but the problem is that there are still tensions between the local and the global. So this idea of hybridity doesn't really help to think about those tensions, I think. And there's also another way to think about the way people are living now. Instead of thinking in terms of rootedness, we should think in terms of networks. And, but the problem is that, as you clearly show, both your presentation, the local is still significant, it still matters, so we still have to think in those type of terms. But I don't know what you think about that, but I think we need to work on conceptual terms about this. For example, I was trying to get an idea, and it was difficult. I don't think I have anything very interesting to say, but for example, the notion of base camp. This type of notion may be interesting because a base camp is a place which is very important, a local place which is very important. There may be, if you go climbing up in the mountains, there may be some life issues, but at the same time, this is a base. I mean, it helps you to go away to reach new other places. So this is a way to think about connection between the local and on the national and the transnational and that type of things. I don't know what you think about this. And maybe I have one last issue. One particular topic I would like to hear your comments is about language. And probably there's something very different between the UK and the other countries like France, Spain, and Italy, for that matter. I mean, migrating is not the same problem when English is your native language and when it is not. I mean, going to Panama, for example, it's quite different. But how do the people you interviewed talk about that? I mean, those English people moving to France or to Spain, how far do they try to master the language? How far do they consider that speaking Spanish, for example, essential to master the local resources? How do they deal with that? And for those upper middle class managers, how do they deal with language regarding social reproduction? You mentioned there was a small mention of the children, but how do they consider English? Do they consider it in a utilitarian perspective? I mean, because this is the language you need to master in order to do business, or do they think that they should be really educated in English in order to be a true cosmopolitan or transnational people? And so, because I think language is really important to define your relation with your national identity. So in which perspective do those upper middle class managers position themselves regarding their children? Do they think that they should be mainly English-speaking people, or do they think that French or English or Spanish or Italian is still very important for them? So that's...
Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I start?
Sure.
I'll start on the last question. Unsurprisingly, it's a question that I receive quite often, particularly about British people in France. So I think the first thing to say is that this is much more complicated. There are, of course, people who are fluent, and there are, of course, people who don't speak any French at all. But I think that what's interesting is to think with that and what it tells us. And increasingly, I have been thinking about this, both in terms of the fact of what people would say if you made similar comments about more underprivileged populations needing to speak French or needing to speak English, as is the case. But also in terms of the privileges that allow British people to move and why Britain is the exceptional case within Europe in terms of the numbers of people who move. Within Europe, while we're still in Europe, and further afield. And a lot of this, you know, more recently I've been thinking about in terms of the kind of post-coloniality of Britain's migrations, and how this, you know, sense that you can move without learning the language might be quite particular if understood in those terms. Of course, it creates some issues if you move somewhere where you don't speak the language. And certainly one of the issues, particularly with the British people in France, would be to do with what they might do if they got sick. Much as they love the French healthcare system, if they were seriously ill, what that might then mean in terms of who, you know, whether they felt like they belonged here in a situation where they had ailing bodies. In the case of Panama, it's a bit more complicated because around that issue, which is quite a significant one, the healthcare issue, currently all medical professionals in Panama are trained in the US, so they all speak English. So at that point, it becomes a different, you know, the level of care that's expected, all of those types of things, those pair together quite well. There are, again, as in France, people who speak fluent Spanish and people who don't speak any Spanish at all. And the onus that they place on their need to learn Spanish will vary depending exactly on what type of life they think they're leading there. So there are some people who want to be involved, who do learn Spanish, who do have Spanish friends, and there are other people who want to hold themselves up in a gated community. And never leave it. So there's a variety of different people within that. So language interplays in different ways in that. But again, you know, of course, if you go to Panama and you do not speak Spanish, you can live if you are rich enough or if you're wealthy enough to be positioned within that new environment. Because undoubtedly they aren't necessarily incredibly rich people, but the value that they bring with them goes a lot further there. They are positioned much higher up in the hierarchy by virtue of being white mostly and by having particular types of property assets in ways that they wouldn't be elsewhere. So I'll hand over to Patrick. Yeah.
That's a point for me. Well, very briefly, number one, I think what Michaela is showing was not appropriate for the rest of Europe. I think the crisis has changed dramatically the line. It took a long time for us to do the book. I think the crisis has one effect, you know, about 900,000 people left Portugal, about 2.5 in Spain. We have big numbers in France. So I think what she's describing is probably going on as well now in a number of other countries. So from my point of view, I think it's very important to really do that. On the question of children, I think the results are very clear. Number one, we have good data on the change of learning language all over Europe. There's a book by Jürgen Friedrich, the German scholar, who've done, you know, very precise. And of course, the UK was the exception. So it's the only country where the level of learning a new language declined over the last 20 years. You know, so you have something telling you about Brexit before. And so it's about a third of people. But you have a sort of long term in Europe of learning more language. For the groups we studied, you know, all middle class in Europe, we know that education has become an obsession for everybody. Okay? So, of course, this obsession for education is replicated for language. So that means that everybody we interviewed nearly they are obsessed with their children learning good English. Okay, it's an absolute obsession. They have to prepare them for the future world. So everybody, everywhere they do that. In Spain, in Madrid, you had the booming education system is crèche in several languages and schools for under 5 years. You see all over Madrid, learn German and Spanish, English and Spanish, French, German and Spanish. So this is one way to distinguish and to have a special elite education system. In Italy, you see things similar. So that's massively for the children. We even have crazy people who are, not crazy, not so. We have some people, they decide to raise their children in one language, which is English. We have some extreme, it exists, okay. We have some extreme case, or you have two Italians and one of them will, because they know that you speak at early age, two languages to children, so one of them will speak English all the time to a child, even if he's Italian. So we have lots of examples of that. So yes, it is a major point. Second thing I wanted to say in your question, I'll finish by the conceptual one. Maybe hybrid, yeah, I will just answer the hybrid one. Number one, I do not agree that the obsession we have now is to conceptualize, okay? I think we have seen in social science, and in particular in critical urban geography, an obsession with inventing new concepts all the time, with mediocre, if not ridiculous, empirical work, okay? And I'm a little bit tired of all these people trying to invent new names and new things. I think we may need some conceptualization, but far less than we think. It's not a sort of precise rupture from one to the next. Those processes we describe are slow-making process. French geographers, learn some sociology, please. A lot of this process of change are slow, transforming process over time. Okay? So you don't need a new concept to explain everything. You really need to refine, some of them you need, but you really need to understand how some existing ones are changing over time and see the dynamics. So I don't think you will need something special for local, global, or whatever. What we see is that some parts of societies is being reorganized at the transnational level. So rather than one concept for everything, I'll do my hard sociologies today, I think some groups of societies are just following different paths. So the conclusion of our book is that we see a sort of urban middle class in the making in different European countries. But we also know that some populations are even more immobile than before in their neighborhoods, and they are less mobile. So you don't need to invent new things for them. Really, the question is to try to mix a sort of more empirical work and research and measure some of those changes, and then see where we need to elaborate some conceptualization. I'm a little bit, I'm just joking, of course, but not entirely. I'm a bit tired of this obsession with let's find a new concept. And frankly, the number of new concepts in critical urban geography, just reinventing the wheel, okay? Policy mobility, oh yeah, very different from policy transfer. Assemblage means nothing 9 times out of 10. No, okay? Just.
I was thinking of real concept.
I know you are. I know you are. I'm just saying the urge for me, if you are a real social theorist, you really want to do a theory like Beck was doing or Neil Brenner is trying, right? Try that. But for the sort of work we're describing here, a lot of things make sense. You say rootedness and networks, but you can combine rootedness and network. If your networks are local, you have evidence of, so a lot of very good operational, you can do that and do measure, and then you make them change and nuance, and then maybe you need some conceptualization. I think what we need at the moment is far more systematic empirical work about all those changes, rather than being the new Beck and changing about something else. I'm really sort of getting hard on that because we have so many papers just saying nothing on all these issues when we need some serious work and then to understand some mechanism and what does it tell us, as you said, about what sort of nation state when you have more mobility. Do we need some, maybe we need some base camp ideas. It's possible, but we need to know, number one, what is transnational? Is it work? Is it seeing TV? What sort of virtual, global? So I think we need much more precise, analytical, and measured empirical work. And the case of John Henry was exactly that. In his last book with Gregory Elliott, he was explaining that the big difference today is that those middle-class people in the previous generation, they had the idea of base camp. They were traveling the world, but they had a base camp. And the new generation didn't have a base camp anymore. Well, they interviewed 37 people. It's just wrong empirically. You know, it's just, we have lots of data, just it's not true. So instead of trying a new concept with that, let's try to understand what is really changing and measure the change over time. And my argument would be, we see a strong social differentiation process. And those people who are a bit more mobile, using the word, they're just becoming urban. It's more a way to redefine the urban, is this concentration of those people who are, you know, more the sort of people I've been describing with 1 foot in, 1 foot out in different ways, and how they combine that. Doesn't change very much, I think, so far. For those who go completely away, it's a serious issue. For those who are combining both, they try to get the best of both worlds. I mean, it's a classic differentiation strategy. So I'm not entirely sure about the need for super new concept. I think we need some of them, I'm sure, but we particularly need more systematic data about what is going on in a number of those issues. Okay. Sorry about that.
So I think the word can be yours now. Is there any question? Yeah, I think I've seen the hand.
Okay. We have to turn off the mic while this one is on.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Jan Raat, University of Amsterdam. I completely support Patrick's plea for more empirical research. So I think, yeah. I have one comment and one question. The comment pertains to Patrick's remarks about the game of distance and proximity. I mean, in my own research in Amsterdam, this is completely confirmed. You see that middle-class people, they tend to treat, they love mixed neighborhoods, but they tend to treat ethnic minorities as part of the decorum. They don't see them as people with whom you can interact. And I'm sort of overstating this, but nonetheless, the pattern is very clear. What's important, certainly in Amsterdam, that this is greatly facilitated by the local government, and that points to the development of the local government. So maybe Patrick could say a bit about that. The other question that I have is about the lifestyle migration. I'm really puzzled by the concept, because you associate it with economic privilege, with foreign direct investments, notably in property investments, and that's entirely what I not have in my mind. What I have in mind is, say, young people coming from, say, Portugal, reasonably educated, can't find a job, they're looking for the European labor market, and then they go to Berlin, or to London, or to Amsterdam. They don't go to the rural area, they don't go to Liège, they go to a particular type of places because they want to be involved in what they think is a creative city. And they want to build up a career or set up businesses in the cultural industries. Very often, economically, they're not very successful, they get flexible work, but they're nonetheless part of this cool scene. And after 1 or 2 years, when they discover that they hardly have an income to pay for the rent, they become a barista, which is a dead-end job, but still with a cool reputation. And what they are basically looking for, as I see it, is the experience. They want to be somewhere else in another country, spend a few years, and then go back. So how does that connect to your definition of lifestyle migrants? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I realised that in the presentation today I focused much more on the kind of how governments perceive these people as economic subjects and didn't describe in as much detail as I could have done who these people are and how they articulate those migrations. So in terms of pairing together, you know, in Panama the case is that these are retirees, of course, with those younger people. I think that probably the best way into that is to think then about how these people describe what they've done and why they've done it. And they don't describe it in those economic terms necessarily. They might do, but it would be paired with explanations about what this place offers. So the amenities, not necessarily the amenities, the kind of leisure opportunities, the type of life, the quality of that life, in ways that we could also say, you know, that these young people moving to these cities, in their head they have an imagining of that place, which drives their engagement with that place, their desire to want to be there, in very, very similar ways. So we have, you know, I've worked with people who also work on those populations in Berlin, which seems to be one of those places which inspires the imagination of these young people, and have used those concepts and ways to think about the similarities and differances. Of course, as people move through their lives, what they want from a place is going to change quite a lot as well. So I think that getting too hung up on the retirement side of things, which is what we've tried to do by shifting away from the retirement migration conceptualization, neglects the kind of cultural side of things, how people imagine what their retirement would look like, or what their youth would look like, or what their family life would look like. So we focused a lot on imaginings, actually, when we've talked about that, and looked through motivations from that point of view, rather than the kind of, you know, the economic. And of course, the economics supports that. If it's cheaper to live somewhere, you can have that way of life. Yeah, no, I mean, in the case of these people, it is. But yes, I appreciate that as well. There are movements from lower value economies to more higher value economies. But I should also just say, before I pass over to Patrick, you know, one of our conceptualizations, the affluence side of things, is not only to do with economics; it's also to do with cultural capital. Carrying with you that, you know, whether it's the ability to speak another language, whether it's the high levels of education that people are bringing with them when they move. So we're not dealing solely with that economic distinction of class. So.
Well, very briefly, because I've spoken too long. Number one, I think what you say, and just emphasize the fact that we have to differentiate according to various social groups, and age is one. I think what happens to young people in Europe is very different from retirees in other places. So age is one of the social differentiation where the processes may be very different. And I would add one to the one you said that we had in our surveys also, finding a partner. I mean, those cities, and you move to these places, it's also a formidable, you know, market to find a partner. You find educated young people having experience. There's something going on also in this sort of mobility, which may be true also for retirees, but I don't know. We'll see if it's something that will play a role in the future. It was a famous case of immigration studies when we see families of migrants coming to various places, and then the woman divorce and marry a wealthy local, and then the man stays on his own. It's a classic, all the other way around, but it's a classic thing. On local government, I don't know. We have not seen that precisely. I've not seen something very clear. My understanding is that local government is not very clear in what they want to do in those things, at least in the cities. We have some discourses, but in what they really do in terms of policies, I don't know. I have to think about that. I don't see obvious element.
Good morning. This is a question for Michaela. I just wanted to ask...
Sorry, could you just present yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Claire Colomb from University College London. It's a question from Michaela. I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with the fact that the boundary between primary and secondary residence is more and more blurred? You seem to have concentrated on people permanently relocating their home in another country, but it's increasingly difficult actually to draw a firm line between primary and secondary. Even for the retirees you're mentioning, many of them may sort of go back and forth between two places, and they may have strategies of maintaining two places at the same time. The reason I'm thinking about it is on Saturday morning I was at a conference in the Marais in Paris where people were discussing the impact of Airbnb on their neighborhoods, and in the conversation came the strategies of wealthy Italian expats having a flat in Paris permanently since 30 years, and how some of them decide not to rent it, to be able to use it 6 months a year and be in Milano 6 other months a year, whereas others see it as a strategy of capital accumulations with different impact for the neighborhood. So this made me think that perhaps this very tight distinction between a primary home, a secondary home, and the subject of your study may be quite blurred.
So when I said that one of my reasons for insisting on the fact that some of these people are primary residents and this is their main residence is precisely because very often when I talk about this, people say, oh, you know, second homeowners. Second homeowners are, you know, you're right in the sense of talking about how there are blurred boundaries. But all of those assumptions about second home ownership, about these empty properties that are being rented out, they don't really deal with the fact that there are people who are relocating almost wholesale. They may go backwards and forwards to visit friends and family. Certainly the people I worked with in France, the criteria for their involvement in the research at that point was that they had to be living permanently in France. So that was the criteria that underpinned that. In Panama, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And obviously, well, not obviously, because I didn't make that very clear. My research in France was done in the early 2000s, when we were talking about a very, very different type of landscape to the one that we're dealing with now. We're dealing with pre-high-speed internet, definitely. I was still on dial-up. Whereas in Panama, I started working there in 2008. So there are quite big differences from the point of view of the technologies that would even support those types of things. But I would warn against going too quickly towards assuming that, you know, that everyone is a second homeowner and that they have all of these possibilities of being in multiple places. Some people don't want that. And actually that was very, very clear, particularly among the older men that I worked with in both Panama and in the UK. They didn't want to be going backwards and forwards. They wanted to stay put somewhere. So we can assume a lot about the kind of the cosmopolitan, transnational elements of these people's lives, when actually some people really, you know, they make one move, and just because they make one move doesn't mean that they're highly mobile. So I think that that's something that's worth thinking through as well. But I don't deny that there is an increase of people who are caught up in, you know, primary, secondary residence issues and might be taxed in one place and living in another. But I just warn against too quickly going towards that kind of conceptualization that that's what's happening, that we're in this heightened mobility. So
one question maybe specific for Patrick and then the question for both. Talking about concepts, so you didn't translate the entre-soi concept on your slides, so how would you translate that in English, entre-soi? And this relates to one of your arguments in your presentation, saying that many high social group migrants were keenly urban in their ways of using public space, etc., but in specific neighborhoods, which, of course, as you emphasized, is very different to be using the open space in different areas of the city. So, and this entre-soi notion is quite ambiguous in that respect, because you have a very small scale entre-soi in gated communities, and then a larger scale entre-soi in neighborhoods in which all people are really looking like you. And my question to both, actually, I forgot, but yes, one of the key issues raised in this series of seminars is how the urban fabric and urban space is transformed by the internationalizing, the contemporary forms of internationalizing of cities, and so Patrick emphasized that there are people are not so mobile, etc., and that mobility was not the key per se, but on the other hand, we have this feeling that this mobility of high-income international elites has really important effects on urban forms, the urban fabric, and the kind of urban products that are offered to these expected urbanites. So, would you support that view that this has relatively significant effects on the urban fabric and urban forms and urban projects, or is it also very marginal when you take a larger view on these issues?
Okay, so I think that, this is where I think that context becomes really, really important. And certainly when I was looking at Panama City, the transformation with the expectation of foreign investment in property is like nothing else. You know, people think that London is transforming at some kind of hideous pace.
It is.
Which it is, and you go to Panama and it's like that, but on speed. So really, I mean, literally within 50 meters of the hotel that I was staying in, on every single side, there were skyscrapers going up. And then you start to multiply that. They've transformed a rubbish dump into a village of skyscrapers. You know, and this is with the expectation of foreign investment, both in residence and in retail. So there certainly is something going on there. It's a particular economic strategy of that government to make Panama into this crossroads, because they can't guarantee the future of the canal, partly. But then you could go to other places and it might not be quite so extreme. They might have other forms of investment that they're pursuing. But yeah, certainly in that case, it's very, very marked.
No, I'd say the same thing. Of course, those cities who are in this financial market, Ludovic Albert will tell us everything about that. Yes. For some cities, it's becoming a major case of transformation, but those who are not on this circuit, for various reasons, they are not desirable, or the local government prevent them to do so, it's a minor influence. Even in Lyon, you know, you have Confluence a bit, but not, you know, really it doesn't play an important role in the whole transformation of Lyon in that sense. And of course, in some other cities, it could be absolutely massive. So I think differentiated with the type of financialization probably will make sense to really analyze that more precisely. Now, the other thing is, in a way, one of the big hypotheses that was not verified was we were thinking that those people who have been transnational and when they come back, that will have some effect on the way they are, you know, rooted and the way they are part of the social fabric in the city. And basically we found no connection whatsoever. So there's no connection between, in this urban fabric element, there's no connection between being transnational or non-transnational figures on every indicator. We don't see a little bit sometimes on the values, but nothing on the practice. So that was just link was not there. And on Entre-soi, you remember, yeah, of course, it's a thing from Pinson-Charlot, so it was really on one very, very high elite from small groups in smaller. So we didn't translate it because, I don't know, I didn't find the term in English, and my translator didn't help me either on this one. But the idea of Entre-soi is also, this localized element is very strong, so it doesn't include the network. So in a way, what we were arguing that for the people who are studying, this entre-soi, we are in a neighborhood, in a place where we are isolated from the rest of the world, was not very important. It's the opposite conclusion of Pinson-Charlot, but we are not studying the same population. But by contrast, what we're seeing is this capacity to remain the same type of social circles for a number of issues was very strong at the level of the urban. Except that, on top of that, you can mix with all sorts of people when you want to do that, when you are in control. So it's completely different from Entre-soi from that point of view.
I'm Camille Schmoll. It's completely connected to what you just said. I was just wondering, is that particular from people that are moving, or is it only the way now the upper urban middle class deals with diversity, is playing with distance and proximity? I'm not sure there is anything particular with mobile people.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your participation.